Working Cows Podcast, episode 274.
Welcome to the podcast that gives producers a platform to discuss and share paradigm-challenging practices. Practices that have increased the effectiveness of their operation and the joy that their families have received from this lifestyle.
Howdy, everybody. This is Clay Connery, host of the Working Cows Podcast. Very excited for another year of podcast episodes, and very excited to form some new partnerships along the way as well. So if you've got a product or service that you, or an event that you want to let people know about, go ahead and reach out to me at the workingcows.net/contact page, and we'd love to partner with you to get the word out about your product, service, or event, or whatever else you might want to share with us. Also wanted to announce the return of my wife's blog, Miranda's Monday Musings. So look forward to that. Head over to the show notes page for today, workingcows.net/274, workingcows.net/274, and you can resume reading my wife's blog content. So really excited about the return of that. And today, just to give you an idea of where your spots might fall on the Working Cows Podcast, if you chose to partner with us, I'll just give a shout out to my wonderful Patreon supporters. They've been with me for a long time, many of them, and have just done so much to be a blessing to my family and we really appreciate their support over the years, as well as those who've supported the podcast by sending audio recording equipment, mostly through the Patreon wish list. It's been a huge blessing. Everything I've got for recording audio has been sent to me, so very much appreciated. The show would not be what it is today without all of the support from Patreon and the Amazon wish list. So shout out to those guys, and if you want your ad in this spot going forward, you can reach out to me at the workingcows.net/contact page and get your words out to this audience. So today I'm very excited to be joined by John Haskell of Ranch Right LLC and Ranching.fyi, and partnered there at Ranching.fyi with Wally Olson and Cinnamon Linhart, and then also runs Ranch Right LLC, which is a bookkeeping service, among other things, for ranchers, and we're going to talk to him a little bit about that today. But mostly what I wanted to talk to him today about was the fact that he made this comment on a recent RFP Online webinar that I was hosting, where he said that we need to match our businesses and the structure of our businesses to our stage in life and what we are doing, what we are capable of doing at that moment in our life, match our business structure to that so that our businesses serve us well. And so I invited him to come on the podcast. He said, hey, let's do it live. We're just 3.5 or 4 hours apart. He lives in Sheridan. I'm near Mud Butte, South Dakota, and he's in Sheridan, Wyoming. So he came over and we met at a coffee shop in Spearfish, and shout out to the fine young ladies working at the City Brew coffee shop in Spearfish for turning off the background music and letting us sit there for an hour and a half or so and record this episode. So you're going to notice a change in the acoustics here going forward in this episode, but really appreciated this conversation with John Haskell of Ranch Right LLC. So I hope you enjoy it as well, and we'll see you on the back end. John, thanks for joining me today on the Working Cows Podcast.
Thanks for having me. How are you?
Good. It's been too long. I've had your name on a list for a long time, so it's good to finally get you.
Fantastic. I wasn't ready before today. So perfect.
Well, you made an interesting statement on recent Ranching for Profit RFP Online Webinar that I've been hosting for the last couple of years, and really was just something that I thought, man, that there's a whole episode in that one sentence, I think, at least, and something to the effect of managing our businesses in such a way that they match up with our stage in life, or as maybe we've talked a little bit about before we started recording here, even the maturity of our business. Like, you can be at a later life stage if you start ranching later in life with an immature business and still kind of have the same challenges that you would just starting out as a young person. So maybe just set the the groundwork for us a little bit about what some of the things you're thinking about as far as the matching our life stage or business maturity to our business structure.
You bet. So maybe the best place to start is actually at the end. A thing that came to mind at one point while talking about succession with Dallas Mount was that there is a real collision between the older generation and a younger generation. And that collision largely comes because of being in a different place in their financial life. So imagine an older generation that has accumulated some assets that maybe their energy level is lower than it was 20 years before, that maybe their interest level is lower than it was 20 years before, and whose interest in security is much higher because they don't have time to recover from a financial disaster. And you pair those people with a younger generation who have all of the exact opposite characteristics, right? We've got lack of experience, we've got high enthusiasm, high energy, we've got no assets, and we've got a real need for cash. If you're young and come back to the ranch and have children to raise, we all know that is more expensive than my dad, for example, who's in his 70s and enjoying the good life, walking his dog every day. So it's just a more expensive time of life, and you have literally less ability to pay for it. So that conflict is what really got me thinking about how we structure our business through time. And I'd kind of been thinking about it a little anyway, because as I've gotten older, I realized that I'm not interested in doing the same things I was when I was in my 20s. So, for example, and we're going to circle around a little here, but custom grazing, and really hitting the hardest country I could because that was what was available to lease, and looking for those real opportunities that nobody else wanted. I had the energy and enthusiasm and the desire to do that. I turned 50 this year, and I don't really want to do that anymore. Some of the country I used to run around in and graze cattle in and run electric fence in, polywire, that sort of thing, it's like, man, that just does not look like any fun. So it dawned on me that not only is that generational collision sort of an important thing to understand in order to get two sides to talk to each other in a succession process, but it really it explains to us how we probably ought to be thinking about our working career. And what became very clear to me is that if I'm doing the same thing in my 50s that I was doing in my 20s, I'm probably not doing something right. Mm-hmm. And so just like we think about taxes and debt very differently, depending on your financial situation, I think thinking about the underlying business strategy and the asset management strategy that you employ should change through the arc of your career. So imagine that's a 30 or a 40-year time span. On the left-hand end, I think of it as you're in your 20s, you have nothing, you have desire, you have enthusiasm, and you've probably been to a class where you know you're smarter than your dad or anyone 20 years older than you and above, And then there's, and then as you progress along that arc, there are going to be some mistakes which you have plenty of time to recover from. But there's also going to hopefully be some, you're going to learn how to be in business. You're going to learn how to recover from a disaster. You are going to hopefully be accumulating some small assets. Wally Olson talks all the time about entering the business, buying, lambs or heifer, light heifer calves, and exiting the business out of, 5 or 6 year old cows. And there are so many different reasons why that works. It's taken me a long time to feel like I've digested about half of them. The first part is, of course, you can buy those, lower cost assets. So think of like a ewe lamb, right? Mm-hmm. They're cheap. You can buy a bunch of them with not very much money. So there's a low bar to entry. It doesn't take a lot of capital, but it does take a lot of care. So, the model I have in my mind is a series of flywheels where we start on the left-hand side with a very small, very light flywheel that has to turn fast to really generate anything. And on the far right, we have a massive flywheel that has a lot of a lot of weight, a big diameter, and it's very hard to stop, but it turns very slowly. So if you imagine a ewe lamb or even a chicken, right, is the left-hand end of that spectrum of flywheels, and the right-hand end is real estate. Right, the biggest, slowest turning, but hardest to stop, most consistent asset, right? So, and in the middle, we can walk through a stage of, you can go from a ewe lamb to a pregnant ewe or a breeding ewe, right? You can go from a heifer calf to a pregnant cow, to then, flocks and herds of them, right? Large numbers of them. And the whole time we need to be managing both the cash flow from the standpoint, like we talk about in Ranching for Profit, sort of without thinking about taxes. And then as we go through our career, we have to change and start thinking about managing taxes. Jordan Steele uses the term constantly, and I love it, which is after-tax wealth accumulation. Mm-hmm. When you are in your 20s and you don't have anything, you don't have a tax problem. When you are exiting the business, like Wally did, 5 or so years ago, you potentially have a tax problem, and you wanna not ranch to avoid taxes. We never do that, but I hope there is a point where you are generating so much profit in that business that taxes become your biggest expense and therefore something you should manage. And when we manage taxes under a strategy that thinks about the life, the arc of our career, that gives us the opportunity to plan our exit from the business long before we actually do, right? We often talk about this in terms of real estate. We don't talk about it very often in terms of livestock.
Right.
But the same basic principles apply.
And I think that what spurred your comments on the webinar was a comment from Shannon Sims about a discrepancy between how they understood their numbers and how their accountant understood their numbers. And you said something about at this stage in their life, the cow-calf thing is where they want to be looking towards the real estate kind of. Am I capturing what you were talking about?
Yeah, you really are. And the difference in those flywheels, if you think about it that way, has a lot to do with cash flow. So I am a cash guy. Cash is king. Cash flow is the most important thing in your business. These are things we really focus on. Most people try to jump the asset ladder before their time. And if I remember correctly, part of what we were thinking about it in that discussion was this idea, or it led me to think about, I know too many people who buy real estate too early, right? Real estate produces terrible cash flow, generally. Right. There are places where it does, and I should specify that's agricultural real estate, right? The people that do real estate really well through cash flow are the people that buy apartments and rent them out, right? That's a very different thing. But the sort of owning real estate and running your own cows on it is a disaster if you're not already set up. If you haven't done the prep work, if you will, to get to where you can handle an asset of that size that turns that slowly. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So back to the cow thing, that cows are in the middle of that whole spectrum, and they give us a real opportunity to accumulate a real asset base, a meaningful asset base, right? Because you can buy 1 and then 2 and then 3 and then 4. You can do it in stepwise progression. If you manage that business profitably, you can capture cash flow from those cows, and you can use that cash flow to reinvest into more cows, right? And so you wind up with a compounding effect there that we need to talk about more later, but I think that's kind of the basics of what you were talking about, right?
Yep. As we are getting started out, we have that energy, the drive, we have openness to risk and trying new things that maybe later generations, are in a different place, so they're not willing to do that. And so when we have the energy, the drive, and the willingness to try new things, openness to risk and those kinds of things, the custom grazing thing is attractive also because of the cash flow generation. And then as we progress and mature in our businesses, our motivations change, our relationship to cash flow changes. And I guess in your mind, what is the biggest misconception people have about the purpose of cash flow or the purpose of money in a business?
So, too often I hear people say that they want to make a profit to do something personal. So they say, I want to make a profit so that we can take a vacation. In my mind, that is not profit, that is not what profit is for. That is what your wage is for. When we build a marginal business and are kind of living on the boundary of being what I'm going to call successful, and I'm strictly speaking financially in that sense, but I think it overflows into a number of different areas. But when we're living on the margin like that, we aren't really building something that is going to carry us later. Okay, and the idea of this is a lot like we think about cows, right? I don't I know lots of people who work for their cows. I don't want to work for their cows or my cows. I want my cows to work for me. And I'd love it if their cows worked for me. That would be good too, but that's a little harder to pull off. But this idea that that profit is for vacation, profit is so we can remodel our home, profit is so that we can send the kids to college. That's unacceptable in my mind, and I draw a pretty hard line there because I feel like people misunderstand. Profit is to grow the business. Now, in your I should maybe segment that a little, because earlier in your career, profit is to grow the business. Even later in your career, it is also for that. But as you are transitioning out of a business, whether you're a leased land operator who's at the end of his career or you're a landowner, making the transition to the next generation, profit then becomes a way of smoothing that transition, right? So I say all of this with the caveat of in about the last 5 or 10 years of your career, things change fairly dramatically. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But if we assume a career is 30 or 40 years, that leaves, let's say, 30 to 35 years where profit is for growth, and you put profit back into the business. One of the funnest statistics there is that the very, very wealthy people in this country are almost all business owners. They are not investors. So we hear a lot about Warren Buffett in the news, right? And what a great investor he is, and he's made a wonderful career of it and become very rich doing it. But he is an anomaly. The Jeff Bezoses, the Elon Musks, the Microsoft, Bill Gates, the people that build businesses actually tend to generate wealth much faster than investors do. And the secret to it is compounding profits. We think about compounding in the context of equity investing and investing in stocks and bonds and mutual funds, right? And we think of it in interest in our savings account, or at least we used to when interest rates were not zero in our savings accounts. But the idea that the money you make makes money, that takes our wealth generation from, or our asset accumulation, if you want to talk about it that way, from a linear process where we rely on the market to take us up kind of $1 at a time, to an exponential process where we can see a doubling in reasonably short order. Compounding, the best rule to think about with that is the rule of 72, right? If you divide 72 by your rate of return, you come up with your rate of doubling. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So if I'm getting a 10% rate of return, after fees and everything else, right, then I will double my money in 7.2 years. It's very good. But when we see people that have a 25 or 30% rate of return in their small business, which is very doable, the doubling time, is a third of that. And again, that in my mind that's real wealth generation.
Yeah.
When you're on that bubble, 8 to 10%, there are business analysts that argue that at 10% you're not actually profitable, because it doesn't take very much of a bobble for that thing to kind of fall over. And nobody else is going to be interested in buying into a business at 10%, because I can buy Microsoft and get a return similar to that. Microsoft is probably more credible than our businesses, right? Yeah. But again, that idea that we have profit, we put it back into the business and we compound it, and there are a couple of different strategies we'll use to do that based on what we're talking about today, kind of where you are in your career. But the faster you can do that, the better. And I literally see examples where people are doubling the value on the bottom of their balance sheet by growing their income. Okay, so they're not doing it by just asset appreciation. They're generally following what Wally talks about. They are capitalizing on asset appreciation, and they are reinvesting it in the business, and then that they're using it to drive net income, on your P&L. They're using it to drive profit, if you will, loosely, and then that profit is what actually drives the balance sheet growth, instead of the increase in real estate value or the market fluctuations in cows or calves or whatever is underneath.
So walk me through a scenario of how this works out, how it fleshes itself out in the real world. Statistics tell me we're talking to majority people between 25 and 40, majority males. Kind of walk me through that how does this flesh it out? What is the 25-year-old guy doing now? What is he going to be doing when he's 40? How does he bridge the gap between now and then?
Okay, so and again, we've touched on it. When you're in your 20s and you have nothing, Greg Judy is the man.
Yes,
right.
No risk ranching.
Right. Greg Judy leases other people's land and runs other people's cattle on it.
But has gotten to the place where he owns a fair piece of the land he's on and owns the cattle.
Greg Judy is older than when I met him 20 years ago.
Exactly.
That's
but
right.
I'm just saying,
yeah, that's right.
He's matured in
Correct.
that business.
That's right. So that's stage one, right? Do whatever you can to get something going. I know a number of people who've actually started out of agriculture, but they've done it in a very smart way. So it used to be that we would talk about, mom has a job and she's a school teacher or a nurse and dad works on the ranch, and that was great. But we were, it's very W-2 focused, very focused on getting insurance, that sort of thing. I understand all that. If you can start, there's a book called The Zigzag Principle. It's a fantastic book. It's about 50 pages long. You can read it in 30 minutes. His whole premise there is you don't necessarily start by going straight at your target. Do something else to generate some income so that you can support your family, and then move yourself towards where you want to be, if that makes sense. And the whole idea is that it's a zigzag. I think the illustration is pretty clear. I know people that have, for example, started a dirt work business where they dig tanks and install troughs and install pipelines, that sort of thing, and they use the profit from that to begin building their livestock business. Does that make sense? So the neat part about that is the power of 1099 income or business owner income as opposed to W-2 income is way more efficient, right? W-2 employees are the most taxed people in our country, and it's true throughout the developed world. It's the same thing. If you have a job and you make good money, you get taxed heavily, right? So in in Wyoming, where we have no state income tax, you're looking at 40% as your upper rate, or in that neighborhood, let's just say. If it's business income, if you are growth is tax deductible. So if you are reinvesting your profits in the business, you do that tax free. And this is one that my wife continually wonders about. Why do they let us do this? This somehow isn't fair. And I'm a huge fan of a guy named Tom Wheelwright, who, if you ever get the chance to meet him or read some of his stuff, he writes and speaks about the fact that the tax code is not about loopholes and cheating and all that. It is literally the rules of the road. And so I'm going to go back to that. We started in this progression and we got a little derailed, but I'm going to go back to the 20-year-old. You have to know the rules of the game. And again, when you're 20, you have a lot of advantages because you don't have a lot of tax liability. There's a whole bunch of things there that sort of assist you in just doing the brute force approach, right? But again, if you really know the tax code, then you know what you need to be doing is keeping your money as efficient as possible. And again, I'm all for paying taxes. I do recommend people pay at least some wage type tax so that they have Social Security in case they become disabled, that sort of thing. That's a whole different topic. But this idea that we don't want to pay, we want to generate as much after-tax wealth as possible, as Jordan says, all has to do with keeping that efficient. When we do it through a business that we own, our reinvestment is very efficient. When we do it through W-2 income, you can still do it, but it's less efficient. So Greg Judy, when I met him, worked for a power company, if I remember right, and that's how he was growing. It's a great approach. It works. But if you can do it, if you can figure out how to borrow a dozer and figure out how to build tanks for, people out in their pasture, or rent a ripper and install pipelines for ranches, you're in the business, if you will, but you're generating a pretty significant cash flow that would support your family and give you excess to invest.
Right.
Okay, so now once we've got, and the critical part of all of this is that we always assume our business is positive cash flow. I don't necessarily always assume it's profitable. I don't really worry about that.
And you're making a distinction there between cash flow and economic profit as far as generating a positive return on the asset.
Correct. That's right. So asset values go up and down, particularly in livestock. I want to see positive asset growth sort of over time, but at any given time, I don't necessarily obsess on that. Does that make sense? Okay. So think of the definition of profit really as a balance sheet definition in many ways, right? And cash flow is a little more about your P&L. They're not quite the same, but anyway. All right, we're close. So cash flow is key. So I have to have enough money to feed my family, to keep the lights on, to put fuel in my pickup, to pay the insurance on my pickup. And that all of us come with a certain level of just expense. It's just expensive to be alive. You may not be paying those expenses, but it's costing someone, right? It's there are dollars that go out every day, no matter what you do. Every time my wife goes to Costco, it's particularly significant, but but that's what it takes, right? So if we go to Costco and buy a month's worth of groceries, it's something, for example, that hurts our cash flow on that day, right? But it may improve it for the month. So we're always have to be kind of looking at that in our business. All right, so now that we're generating cash flow, and now that we're generating excess cash flow, we fall under what I think Alan Nation's best described as the problem of asset allocation. So now what do you do with it? If I take my excess positive cash flow and I go to Hawaii, that may have wonderful positive benefits. It may be very good for my marriage, may be good for my children, may be good for me and my vitamin D level. But it doesn't grow my business, right? It takes that money away and it's gone. If I reinvest that money in the business, and particularly if I reinvest it in a way that allows me to generate more income, more cash flow in the future, now the compounding process starts, right? So whether that is buying another 375-pound heifer, whether it's buying a stock trailer load of light lambs, or maybe older ewes or even older pregnant cows, some low-level, relatively low-cost asset that will generate more cash flow in the future. The model that I love in this interim stage, there are two important parts. The first one is the focus on cash flow means that the asset pays for itself. And this is very much Robert Kiyosaki's definition of an asset, right? So and I'm going to use rental property as he talks about in that book as an example. If I buy an apartment and I rent it out to someone, there are two risks associated with that place. One of them is the cash flow of being able to pay the mortgage, right? The risk of, can I come up with the money every month? And the other is the value of the asset. Does it actually go up over time or even maintain so that I have, it's like worth that to take the loan? Does that make sense? Okay, so in this middle class of assets, we want to be very aware of always splitting those risks. So if I buy a pregnant cow, I am essentially asking the calf to make the payment. Does that make sense? I'm willing to take the risk of the value of the cow, but I'm not willing to take both risks. Okay, so we split the risk of owning that asset into two pieces, and I make part of it someone else's responsibility. If it's a rental apartment, then that responsibility is the tenant. And again, it's still my responsibility ultimately, but the money comes out of their pocket, right? They are the ones that sweat the rent payment at the end of the month, not me. But if it's a calf, right? Again, the idea that our business is profitable and generates positive cash flow, so the calf allows me to continue owning that asset. If I buy a light calf and I plan to own it through slaughter, or I convert my business to where I direct sell meat, for example, and I'm a birth to plate type experience, I am responsible through that whole period of paying all the feed bills, paying all the vet bills, paying all the transportation bills, all of those things. And I get the reward at the end. So I am in that type of scenario, I'm taking both sides of the risk, or I'm taking both parts of the risk. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay. So in this middle part, anytime I can split the risk and be cash flow focused as opposed to appreciation focused, I'm better off. Now, the beautiful thing about that is if I own that cow and I can cash flow her, cost to keep based on the calf income, it doesn't really matter if her value goes up or down. Does that make sense?
Right.
Because I have positive cash flow. If I have a note on that cow, or if I don't, I can continue paying the bills. Okay. But if that cow's value goes up, then I have the opportunity not only to during that cow's life to harvest that appreciation and reinvest it. Okay. So if I buy a heifer calf and I let her increase in value until she's a 4 or a 5-year-old cow, I have calves that I sell all the way along that path, right, to get me to the end. So they kind of they're the financing, right, as we go. We get to the end. Now the cow has hopefully increased in value significantly. Now I sell that cow. I capture that appreciation, meaning I turn it into cash. And this is the great question, right? if an asset appreciates and you don't sell it, does it really appreciate, right? If a tree falls in the forest, does it make a sound, right?
Yeah.
So I capture that appreciation and then reinvest it in another cash flow producing asset. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And I am pretty laser focused on these things have to cash flow, and I need to be as efficient as possible getting the money that comes out of that, comes out at the end, back into a new asset. And so my balance sheet then expands because I've produced cash flow on my P&L and I have increased my asset base. Now, if the market's going down, this still works, but we take our eye a little bit off the balance sheet. We watch our balance sheet more like it's two components. It's number of head, if you will, if we're doing cows, and it's also the cash value of those cows, okay? So I don't care who you were in 2015, 2016, your balance sheet took a hit if you owned livestock or if you owned grain or, anything in ag. It was bad, right? But if I owned the same number of animals and I had a similar cash flow potential, it didn't matter, right? I could still keep going. I was still basically building my balance sheet. I was just doing it in a different market. Does that make sense? And what Bud Williams taught us and what Wally and Doug and all teach us still now is that even if the actual price of that cow when I sell her isn't a lot more than the heifer calf I bought, it's very likely that the relationship is still there so that I can replace that cow that is now at a lower value, a lower absolute value in cash terms or in dollar terms, but I have the ability still to grow my balance sheet on the number side. Yep. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So now as we work our way through that, there becomes another problem. If you spend much time around Wally Olson, what you find out is that, yes, you don't want to manage for taxes, but you have a tax problem. And I know a number of people that started in ranching for profit in the 80s and who were thrilled with what they got going. And, after working through their old depreciation and their old carry forward losses and those sorts of things, they had a $1,000 tax bill one year after not paying taxes for years, and they had a $5,000 tax bill, and then they had a $45,000 tax bill, and then the next year they had to borrow money because they didn't have the cash on hand to pay the $150,000 tax bill that came next. And again, it's all well and good to talk about the fact that we don't manage taxes, and until that number is 50,000 to six figures, I'm not interested, right? We're not going to pay any attention to that because it's not big enough to make a difference. But once it's that size, then it becomes something you manage, and you manage that by using, again, the tax law as Tom Wheelwright talks about. And you bring money, if you are bringing money out of the business, you do it in such a way so that you do it at the lowest possible tax rate. You still pay taxes, generally, but generally we talk about capital gains tax being half the rate that ordinary income tax is. So selling steer calves is the same as having a W-2 job, right? You pay self-employment tax, you pay income tax. You get to pay all of it. Selling cows, if you've owned them, or breeding stock really of any kind, with the appropriate management of your inventory, becomes you are now selling assets, and the IRS treats that very differently. And again, this is not a loophole. The tax code, according to the research done by Tom Wheelwright, the tax code throughout the developed world is basically the same. Yep. The government wants you to own assets, right? They want you to drill for oil, maybe until recently, but they want you to grow food. They want you to drill for oil. They want you to provide housing to others, right? They economic progress drives the funding for government.
Whether or not these people setting the tax code know it in their heads or not,
correct.
The things that make economies grow is saving and investing, not buying. Not buying.
Right. So I'm going to actually argue saving does not grow the economy, right? Because if we all were good savers like we really should be, it would slow economic growth, right? Money in motion is what generates return and taxes.
Yeah. But they're rewarding that money in motion.
Yes, that's correct.
That's what they're doing because that's what is growing.
That's right.
So I'm just saying that's why it's set up that way.
That's exactly
Whether
right.
or not they believe it.
Right.
They can't get away from the numbers, and they're setting it up that way to reward that growth.
Yeah, and thankfully,
or
I'll just say
capitalize on it.
Yeah, that's right. Stupidity is cyclic, right? So, we go through these periods where we're as a group, we get kind of dumb, and we do stupid things, and we make bad choices. But then, something bad will happen, and we'll kind of get things corrected and back on track again. So,
yeah.
There's
good.
a pattern to that. We don't have to worry about the short term.
Right.
Okay, so does that kind of make sense as far as maybe the first half or so of that arc? Okay.
Yep.
So Allen Nation was great to talk about the idea of, poverty is an asset allocation problem, right? Wealth is the same. The other part of this is, again, as we are doing our financials on a regular basis, we need to make sure we are putting our money back into the best things. And the fun part about that is, I promise you, it is never the same. And if we think we are going to make money the same way that my grandfather did, as an example, we're just wrong, and we need to lose that. There is nothing about ranching that is fixed. There is nothing about the markets that is fixed. There's nothing about the environment that's fixed. The people that do well deal with reality, which is, again, what Bud always taught us, and then respond appropriately, right? See what the environment is, and don't fight the tax code. Use it.
Yeah, don't be a victim,
Correct.
of things that are beyond your control.
Right.
Again, whether it's a just and fair system is out of our control.
Correct.
But we live here, as Mr. Wheelwright said, in the rules of the road. These are the rules of the road. This is the hand we're dealt. You've got to deal with it. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to capitalize on the opportunities presented.
Most people that hear me talk about following the rules of the road that know me are going to laugh, because I probably could fill a 24-foot U-Haul with speeding tickets. But that said, I know what the rules are. Sometimes I choose to not follow them because I think I might not get caught. But
it takes a long time to get somewhere sometimes.
Yeah, it does. That's exactly
right. You spent a lot of your career in the West. It's a long ways between places.
And as I told a cop once when I got pulled over who asked, "Why are you going so fast?" I was like, well, I've got a long way to go, and there's nobody else here. Okay, so let's go. You hit on something that a place I've been really spending a lot of time recently in my public speaking, which is this idea of mentality and fundamental belief. And I think, and we talked about this a little before we got on air, most of us around agriculture, in agriculture, even outside of agriculture, know in our minds that agriculture can't be profitable. And the sad part is there's nothing farther from the truth unless you believe that, at which point it becomes the truth. And we all, at some level or another, subconsciously or consciously, have bought into that idea. And it's taken years of being around people like Bud and Wally and a number of others who really don't think that, right? Who really believe that 10% return's not what I'm after. I'm after something much higher than that. I had a little epiphany one day driving around. I think I was driving over to Cody, and it just dawned on me at one point that some of our forefathers built massive wealth in agriculture, right? And they did it when it was hard, right? I mean, we like to whine about how hard it is and how gas is $4 a gallon and that sort of thing, but
you never woke up with snow on your bed from it blowing through the side of your house.
Right. A log cabin with no chinking kind of thing, right? My dad sent me a picture of my grandfather, cowboyed down by Du Bois, not 100 years ago, but a long time ago, when internal water in the house was not a thing,
We all took a bath in the tub in the middle of the living room floor once a week, whether we needed it or not. And Grandpa bathed last in the water that everybody else had used.
Doesn't that sound nice? Real relaxing Friday night.
We lived in a dirt floor. That's a story I heard from a guy one time.
That's exactly right. And anyway, so these guys built huge. They built great businesses. They accumulated vast tracts of land. And again, life was harder then. And we like to fool ourselves about how easy it was. My grandmother is hilarious because she used to say, she's been, passed a long time ago, but she used to say, "Oh, I wish I was a pioneer," And I read these stories of these pioneers like you're talking about, and I think, man, I don't think I would have made it. Like that's, I'd like to think I'm tough in some ways, but not like that.
3-day blizzard, back-to-back 3-day blizzards. One of them was actual snow accumulation. The other one was blowing the snow that fell the week ago around. But man, I don't know how some of those people. I mean, some people didn't survive. I mean, that is the reality.
A lot of them
those
died.
didn't survive, but you are a tough cookie to get through some of that stuff. So, anyways,
and there are lots of stories of settlers who shot themselves in their cabin after being in there for 4 months.
Right. Yeah.
Anyway, so the epiphany was, if they did it, why can't we? And more importantly, they did it, why don't we? Right? And part of it is because I think we just have a very different mentality. They knew great things were possible, right? They hadn't developed all of these terrible, sort of mental models that predicted failure for themselves.
We named a mentality after it, the pioneering spirit.
That's right. And would that we had more of that, right? Now, there are places where you don't necessarily want to be a pioneer, right?
But back to what you were saying earlier, the people who are the most wealthy are the ones who are pioneers in business, right? I mean, Elon Musk, Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, they pioneered things. Yeah. They started things that didn't exist before them, and literally didn't exist before them.
Right.
There was no place to buy everything you need on the internet before Jeff Bezos. There was no place to send money from one person to the other using the internet before Elon Musk and PayPal. So I mean, they literally out of nothing created these things, and so that's pioneering. Yeah, literally.
So funny story in the late 90s or the middle 90s, my grandfather was very interested in trading stocks and did a lot of it. And he taught us all how to do it. And it just was kind of something like a fun little hobby on the side. And I remember in the 90s, he had died and, they were selling Amazon stock. And I just thought, what? That's the dumbest idea ever. Who wants to buy a company that sells books on the internet? What's so great about that? Anyway, I look back on that as the greatest, misjudgment.
Opportunity.
Anyway, and then of course the .com bubble happened in the late 90s, and it was see, those guys don't know what they're doing. Roll forward 20 more years, right. Oh my goodness, what a terrible decision. Anyway, but this idea that incredible things are possible, and the other part is what a lot of people teach. Jack Canfield, I think, writes about it the best, is that we have to take 100% responsibility for our outcomes. Yeah. Whether that's our marriage, whether that's our relationship with our children, whether it's our business, whatever. Now, I can't take 100% responsibility for my height, right? I mean, there are some things that are off the table, but there are so many things that are under our control, and we continue to sort of convince ourselves that they're not. And I feel the need, and Doug Ferguson teaches this as well as anybody, I think. I really feel the need to isolate myself from that a lot, where I can't hang around people who are going to repeat things again and again that are not true, right? Because if it's the whole thing, you tell a lie enough times, eventually you believe it, right? Yeah. That really does sort of grow on you like a fungus, and I think you have to be very, very careful about your mentality and your psychology.
Yeah, I don't think that our thoughts have some intrinsic power in them to actually manifest a reality that doesn't exist.
Right.
But if I'm focused on negative things, I can convince myself that great things aren't possible.
Right.
If I choose to focus on things that I can control and can take responsibility for and remain focused on them, you can accomplish more with that mindset than you can with the victim mindset or, the mindset that says somebody else is to blame for my failure.
Right, 100%. Our church is led by a guy named Russell Nelson, and he's a fantastic thinker, fantastic speaker. He's a retired heart surgeon. And he has this quote that I see on the internet repeated again and again, which cracks me up by people who don't know who he is and that sort of thing. And it is the idea that the joy in your life is a function not of your circumstances, but of your focus, right? We know through research and through personal experience, right? If I get up in the morning and I think about 10 things I'm grateful for, I will have a much better day than if I get up and think about all of the ways my wife didn't please me the day before, right? Yeah. I mean, it's just there are ways mentally to sort of, manipulate yourself, if you will, to see things in a better light.
Yeah. And happiness depends on happenings. Joy depends on Christ.
Yeah, well, very much the same grain, right?
Anchor that in something that doesn't change.
Right. And if Christ is the source of joy, he doesn't go away.
Right.
So it doesn't matter if it's snowing sideways or if it's raining or if I'm upside down in a ditch. The joy is invariant, right? That's unchanging. So
great things are possible.
Exactly. It's probably going to get better. And that's another thing. I feel like we have this constant reset. Things really do get better through time. and we keep forgetting that.
Yeah. And we complain about how terrible the world is from our leather recliners in an air-conditioned building.
Right.
You know, when we get up to go to the refrigerator to get ourselves a cold drink.
Right.
It's like,
Right.
it's kind of hard to believe you at this point.
And I'm older than you are, but it was not very long ago when the idea of having a cell phone was just not. You just didn't. That wasn't. You wouldn't even think about that. You know, the Jetsons type stuff that we live with now, right?
Yeah.
It's amazing. We haven't quite gotten to flying cars, but there are so many things that have improved, and yet we continually reset to this average of whatever we kind of decide our happiness is going to be, right? And so as that bar, if you will, keeps getting higher and higher, our expectations, frankly, become unreasonably higher and higher.
Yeah.
And we keep, making ourselves unhappy that we're not hitting this incredibly high bar. In much like, Wally, when he sets a 25% profit target, if he misses it and get 23, it's not that unhappy, right? It's like, well, still pretty good.
Shoot for the stars. If you
Right.
miss, you land among them.
Yeah, that's right. So, and then...
We're talking about pioneering spirit and great things being possible.
Yes.
Sorry.
Well, okay. So, but then I want to go back to this idea of great things are possible, but you have control.
Yes.
So one of the things we really focus on as a company, and I focus a lot of my professional life on, is helping people understand where they're at. And if you are someone that doesn't believe that great things are possible, then knowing where you're at doesn't really matter, right? But if you believe that great things are possible and you know where you're at, then you can make a roadmap from where you are to where you want to be, right? And again, whether that's in your marriage or that's in your finances. If I have a target of, I want to net $100,000 a year, and I'm losing $20,000 a year instead, if I believe that I am powerful enough to make the 100,000 happen, then if I'm at negative 20, I don't have to be down and out. I need a plan. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so the difference between the victim mentality and the winning mentality, if I can use that a little incorrectly, is that I know where I am. I'm not necessarily happy with where I am, but I am going to make a plan, and I am going to be the one that changes it. So if my ranch is not performing the way I want it to, it's on me. Again, we all know there are plenty of random things that happen, right? But as someone repeated to me the other day, the hardworking tend to be lucky. I think that quote's slightly wrong because it's not just hard work, but it's applying a good plan. Bud used to say this thing all the time. It was infuriating, which was, well, just keep doing the right thing until it works. Well, how do I know I'm doing the right thing? Am I doing this right? No, you're doing it wrong. Like, oh, crap. Well, I've been doing it for 12 hours, so I thought that was the right thing. Being able to discern that is the real challenge, right? That's the fun part of it. But again, that type of persistence in the face of opposition, and there will always be opposition, right? Whenever you set out to do something, there's going to be a roadblock. You can plan on it. It's not always going to be 75 degrees and sunny with no wind and, good rainfall and high markets, right? Plan on that opposition and plan accordingly. Does that make sense?
Yeah. No, it's great. So we've kind of worked through this. The key is to take the profit from the business or the cash flow from the business and reinvest it into growing the business. And
not buying tractors, not buying pickup trucks. That's right. Okay, good.
Yeah. Steelectomy, Dave
Unless
Ramsey
you make
has
money on tractor. Yeah.
Dave Ramsey has his plastectomy. We need a steelectomy.
I love it. Yeah, that's good.
So we do that. When does that shift take place where I'm not growing or I'm not as focused on growth? Now I'm focused on looking at real estate investment opportunities, how do we decide where that shift happens?
Okay, so this became clear to me. I at one point was a custom grazer on a big unfenced piece of very rough range. I wound up in a situation that put me in the hospital for put me in bed for about 4 months after a brief visit to the hospital. You want it to happen before that. Okay, so think of again the same spectrum of that, those asset wheels, if you will. Think of a similar spectrum that is, degree of activity on, high activity on one end and passive on the other end. Okay, we don't necessarily need to go to fully passive income, but we do probably want to get to the point in our life where we don't necessarily have to be there every day. At this age of my life, if I don't have to go cowboy when it's 40 below zero, I'm okay with that. 20 years from now, I imagine it's going to be more so. And there may even be days when my hip might hurt or my, whatever, and I just don't want to go that day. But the time when we really need it is when we can't. And what we see too many of, and I think of some of the great men I've been around who frankly are old and they are tough and they got an amazing amount of physical work done for their age, for their station in life, etc. And I've always had so much respect for those people. And I am someone that, my parents taught me a strong work ethic. I love it. That's what I like to work. And I had so much respect for those guys when I was a young man to think, how in the world is this guy keeping up with me? And he's throwing Advil down like it's, gummy bears. And anyway, but those are the guys that I look back on now and think, as much respect as I have for them and as much respect as I have for that, I would prefer to not have to do that. And I know a number of guys that did it. There's a guy I worked for, Harry Yonkin, probably lots of people know him, was a foreman at the Rex Ranch for a long time, great cowboy. He worked that hard, but he didn't have to because he was a very smart investor. By the time he retired, he owned a lot of real estate in Star Valley and around Jackson and that sort of thing. So he could work that hard, but he didn't have to. And that to me, that was a good model for me. He liked to tell stories about the first time he got a job. I think he put $50 a month into a retirement type account, or an investment account. And I'll just say on I don't know what he made throughout his career, but it wasn't a lot. But he was a Dave Ramsey model of retire with a lot, right?
Right.
The limitation of the Dave Ramsey model, as much as I love it, to my mind, it's a great model for people that aren't either willing or able for one reason or another to really learn how to manage themselves. The Bud Williams, Robert Kiyosaki model, in my mind, is much better for if you are willing to manage yourself and grow into the person you need to be to become a different type of manager throughout your career, that those two processes kind of drive each other. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So I think we got a little off track there. The pivot point, again, as I'm laying in bed, and I was only in my 30s at that point. But, laying in bed, I can't do the work I do every day, right? I can't care for my family. I can't care for myself. You know what I mean? I mean, it's literally, it's bad. So before we get to that point, right, we want to have things taken care of. In the short run, as a 30-year-old, right, you do things like have life and disability insurance to cover you because you're probably not where you need to be yet. But until you're to that point, or while you're at that point, you are growing yourself so that you have a big enough asset base and you have the structure so that you don't have to be there every day. Very similar to managing your business. It's fun when you have a new business to do all of the parts, right? Yeah. We all brag about being the chief cook and bottle washer. I do all the jobs and nobody can do it better than me. But in the same vein, as we build a business, right, we want to be building processes so that we can pass those off to somebody else and then ultimately do the things that we're best at, right? Or drive growth in a new area, or even leave and go on vacation and have things continue to function. That doesn't happen by accident in a successful framework and for long periods of time, right? It requires a lot of groundwork. Much the same way in your asset management strategy, right? You're laying the groundwork the whole time as you're moving up through asset classes and preserving and maintaining that cash flow. You are doing that so that your job becomes ever easier. If you gave me 500 50-pound freshly weaned lambs to take care of right off the truck, right? It's a lot of work. There's potentially the opportunity to make good money doing it, but it's a lot of work, and it's busy, and it requires me to be there pretty much 24/7. If you give me a piece of real estate to rent out to someone else, that's like 4 days of work a year, stroll by, make sure everything looks okay, say hi, leave. I don't have to be there 24/7. The intensity level is much better. So I don't know if there is a time in your life necessarily when you have to think that way. I think there are things that force us sometimes into that, but I think we should be thinking of that. And the best part about it is when we think about compounding, we don't have to just compound everything in the same business. So if I have a ranch business, for example, that's really humming, and I've got great people working for me who pretty much do a better job than I do, and the place runs better when I'm not there, then why don't I go get another one, right? Now, I may not want to do that, or I may want to buy a bookstore in town, or I may want to buy a chain of Chick-fil-A's or, whatever else, but you have the opportunity to do other things. And I love the fact that we get as focused as we do in our industry, and I think that our industry offers opportunities for profit and scaling that is really unparalleled in a lot of other industries. So I'm not a big fan of necessarily taking money out, and like putting it in a 401k, although again, I think for some people that is a great strategy. But again, if you want to build more business to continue doing the same type of thing, have at.
So you drew a distinction between Robert Kiyosaki and Bud Williams and Dave Ramsey, and talked about the fact that people who can't manage themselves necessarily kind of need that Dave Ramsey, I would say, set of restrictions. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, very much.
So then are you saying on the other side that debt is a tool that we could use to grow the business, or is it something else?
Okay, so let's back up just a second, because I don't want anybody to think that I'm casting any aspersions on Dave Ramsey. He is a fantastic teacher. He teaches people amazing things. He has helped more people than really anybody I know. I mean, that guy has done, for people's personal finances, has done incredible things. That said, I'm not Dave Ramsey, right? I'm not as wealthy as Dave Ramsey.
Right.
So you can argue that I don't have any business saying anything that contradicts what Dave Ramsey says. Okay, so with that caveat, I think that we can look at debt as a tool. I think there are situations where debt provides some advantages. I think that most of us use debt very badly. Most of us have a very bad relationship with debt, and most of us want nothing more than to just be out of debt.
I think a lot of times debt can be a tool for subsidizing a poor business.
100%. And so funny enough, I just had a discussion with someone during kind of a roundtable deal where they weren't necessarily using debt, but they were using the rest of their finances to subsidize a crappy business. And again, I don't mean to cast aspersions. They I often run a crappy business myself. So, we've all been there and we'll be there again, right? But this idea that the debt is the problem is a problem. Now, I'm going to completely excise any type of consumer or personal debt from that. Okay, I totally agree with Dave Ramsey. Living on your credit card, buying TVs on your credit card, having car payments, those are all bad. Those are bad financial decisions, right? And, you listen to the TikTok finance crowd, and, you should finance your electric vehicle because you get the tax credit, and then you can, it's like, I have no interest in that. I think that leads a lot of people down the wrong road. And I think even Robert Kiyosaki, I have a tremendous amount of respect for him. I'm also not as wealthy as he is. But he sometimes leads people wrong because he talks enthusiastically about debt. But when you hear more detail from him, he also has this very strict rule about there is no credit card buying of a 60-inch TV, right? I'm not paying my bills and supporting a lifestyle with my credit card, right? He's doing things that are different than that.
Right.
And
it's a leverage tool.
It is a leverage. And I think most of us, the way we deal with debt would be just better off to not have it.
Right.
But that said, I've been to plenty of, EL meetings and other HMI type, or regenerative type things where people's enthusiasm, and I've seen individual businesses where people's enthusiasm is for getting out of debt. Mm-hmm. And that's a crappy goal in my mind, okay? If your debt is supporting a bad business, and which, again, we'll go back to balance sheet appreciation, we often support a bad business with real estate appreciation, right? We have bad cash flow, but the banker's okay loaning us more money because, well, let's face it, that ranch is probably worth $25 million, so there's no chance I'm not getting my money back, right?
Right.
Now, I have a problem with bankers and that approach to the world, right? But at the same time, I understand why they do it, and often they're doing it out of the goodness of their heart, right? But it's not helping anyone get to the point they need to really be able to do it. Again, is there appropriate use of debt? I absolutely think so. I think you better have crossed a few thresholds. One of the other things about this asset model and sort of career trajectory model that I love is it gives a person an opportunity to build skills at the appropriate level, right? So Proverbs, run before you walk, or walk before you run, excuse me. Right? If you're dealing with $10,000 worth of ewe lambs and you really stub your toe, it's not going to ruin you, right? You're probably not going to commit suicide or, ruin the rest of your life for that, right? You may have a bad weekend. You may feel pretty bad about yourself, but you can get yourself picked up and dusted off and go on again. If you make that mistake heavily leveraged on millions of dollars of assets at one time, you are in grave danger, right? There are not only significant financial consequences, but often the personal consequences that come with that are so severe that people don't recover, right? And we've all had that, whether it's a pen of mycoplasma calves or whether it's a storm right in the middle of calving season or whatever that just kicks the crap out of you. And again, back to the psychology part, you've got to be able to get yourself out of that and get on to the next day as though that didn't happen. And another part of the stewardship is when those things do happen, if we take full ownership from those things, it allows us to gather the lesson, as opposed to if we go back to the calving barn and drink a fifth and pass out in the warm room, right? We don't get the lesson.
Right.
We've just kind of avoided the whole thing.
Yeah, we realize that all the people that loved me the day before the mycoplasmic calves pen hits still love me today. We could probably get another
We'll
day.
recover. That's exactly right. But the ability to cope with that is hard.
Right.
And again, Bud used to talk about this at great length. I've been there multiple times. When you're in the middle of just doctoring everything and everything looks terrible, and you just can't get out of it. You're early, you leave early, you come home late, you get out of bed just dragging yourself out because I don't want to go look at that again, But you kind of have to, and then eventually it will go away.
Right. So back to this career arc trajectory. We've gone through the process of investing back into the business. We've gotten to the point where we're like, okay, I can see the writing on the wall. 70 is closer than it used to was. I need to start, making some changes to remove myself from the day to day. That's kind of basically, you want to live your daily life in your 20s, 30s, 40s with that in mind, knowing that day's coming, and growing a business that will sustain you through that. That's kind of the idea.
Yep, that's exactly the idea. And I got to tell you, I laugh because I've been saying recently that I turned 50 this year, and it's still hard for me to believe. Like, I don't feel like an old person, right? When I was young, 50 was old.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that was like. And I'd love to claim that 50 is the new 40 or whatever people say, but it's not true, right? It's a lie that we tell ourselves, but there are just more of us now. But anyway, the idea of me listening to myself give this advice in my 20s is almost incomprehensible, right? I would have said, I'm not listening to that old guy, right? And I wish I could convince more people that that's the case. The great thing is that most of us are probably ready to learn or to listen in our 40s, and there's still lots of time, right? If you're dealing with a balance sheet that is doubling in value every year based on net income, 10 years is plenty. You can build a pretty comfortable nest egg in a very short period of time, right? Doing what you love every day. And that's the really fun, rewarding part. The sad part is most of us are not very good at it, and we don't do a very good job at it, and we still are successful. And if we'll up our skills, we can be really, really successful. And that looks like something that most people can't conceive.
Yeah. So is there a percentage that you would recommend, or is it everything that you can stand to live without after your comfortable standard of living is met? Is that how you think about it?
Great question. That is how I think about it, because that's how my parents thought about it. But I know that's wrong. Let's go towards, again, mentality. We talk a lot. I talk a lot about having a war on costs, right? Burke Teichert's term. I have drunk at that water fountain. Totally believe it. Cutting has value. But we don't want to live with that type of scarcity mentality where we're just crushing everything, right, under the weight of either, underinvestment or underpaying or, just suffering, right, when we have so much upside potential. So it's become really clear to me, looking at our clients, that focusing on the bottom of your P&L, the expense side, whether it's direct costs or overheads, but particularly overheads, has value, right? There is really an opportunity to, if you're ridiculous with your overheads, it's hard to get ahead. That said, I in an interview with Dallas, I think a year or two ago, he asked me the question, what mistake do people make the most? And I think I said most of us our overheads are too high. And I actually don't believe that anymore. I didn't really believe it at the time, and I sadly, thinking about it after I left, realized I was kind of repeating, things I've said, things I've heard other people say. There is so much, there's a limited amount of improvement you can make by cutting costs. And once you're within the realm of reasonable, it's a diminishing returns function before you derail the business by not spending enough, right? However, when we meet people like Bud Williams and Wally Olson, Doug Ferguson, some of the people that I work with, on a regular basis through our business, we see that the top side growth is actually unlimited. And that's where the real possibility lies. So I think you have to start with some very reasonable cost structure that allows you to get kind of out of the starting gate. I made a statement earlier that, if you're taking money out of the business to go on vacation to Hawaii, that's not growing your business. Yes and no, because I think once you're out of that startup phase, right, then take the vacation to Hawaii, right? Or whatever you want to do. Go to Brazil, you want to see a rodeo in Brazil? Knock yourself out. Don't do it when you're leveraged to the hilt and you don't have good cash flow, right? That's a terrible idea. But once you have those things, and I'm thinking about this relatively young guy that we work with who, again, his net worth went from in the neighborhood of a couple $100,000 to multiple millions. And he called me the other day and said, I'm really tired. It's like, you know what? You should take it easy for a little bit. You know what I mean? You've done a great job. Take a breath. Rest is in grazing, we don't not rest our pastures, right? Yeah. We know they need rest. We need rest. So that level of, what financial just spending, we'll call it. I'm not going to call it investment, but that spending on yourself or indulgence or whatever you want to call it is absolutely necessary. I think you want to be very careful about when you're doing it. The first couple of years you're getting up and going, probably not a good time. Once you're up and going and you have that cushion, I don't think it's a good idea to take your eye off the ball, which a lot of people do, but I think you can allow for some comfort, if that makes sense, or luxury even. Again, I wasn't raised in that. My grandparents were Wetzels, right, going back, like they're Germans. They don't, it's just a mentality thing, right? Yeah. I think people that come from more of an Irish heritage have a little looser idea about, things. Yep. And that's casting huge, I realize, huge generalizations that I know is not true, but you kind of get the picture. There are big cultural differences, and most of us grew up with some sort of, almost Eastern European type work ethic that keeps our nose to the grindstone every day for our entire life. I don't think that's necessary. And again, if you're really killing it, why? You may find it fun, and that's great. And if that's what you really want to do, I'm all for it. But your kids might appreciate taking a vacation periodically. Yeah. Which also goes to the romancing the next generation thing that we hear about a lot. I'm not a fan. I think the next generation needs to know what's really going on. Yeah. If the business is successful, I want them to know what success looks like. That's my level of romance. And again, my wife will confirm, not the most romantic guy. But romancing them into something that is not true, right? If the kids only come and work when it's 70, or the kids only come to brandings, right? They don't come to preg check, or they don't come to some, when we're vaccinating cows, they just rope. They don't work on the ground. We're raising terrible little humans if we do that, right? That's not really fair to them. We need them to see what the hard parts are and what the good parts are. Yep. And most of us kind of avoid the hard parts. We talk a lot about doing the Whitby and Whatby work. Most of us prefer one over the other, and we kind of avoid the other one. Often we avoid the what be work, but at our peril, right? And I think our kids, when we romance them, we're saying, we want to not just romance them. We've all dated plenty of people who maybe misrepresented themselves at one point or another during the course of the relationship. That's not what we want to do. We want to be very clear about what it takes to be successful and what that looks like. Because I think for a lot of people, it looks very different than what they have in their mind.
Yeah, for sure. Anything else on your mind as far as this topic is concerned?
Sorry, I have just run my mouth.
You're great. Good.
One of them that in my mind comes up in this type of discussion is, and I think I've heard you sort of poo-poo sweat equity. Mm-hmm. Was that you? Mm-hmm. Okay. Mm-hmm. One of the reasons we do that is because it often doesn't turn into real equity.
Right.
Okay. I'm against sweat equity that doesn't become real equity.
Right.
If you're sweating to produce real equity, that's a very different thing.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
And so in that context, again, when you're on the left side of that light, small, fast asset wheel, that's sweat equity.
Right.
But again, if you don't convert it, you've missed the boat. Does that make sense? And most of us don't convert. It's the conversion of that sweat equity into real equity, financial equity that matters.
I think of sweat equity as Lion King succession planning. Someday this will all be yours.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Whereas like what you're talking about is there is a fixed number assigned to the fact that I'm not getting paid a market wage for these skills.
Yeah.
And there is a certain percentage of the cow herd, percentage of the land, percentage of something that's being transferred to me every year as a just compensation for that.
That's right. And that's true when we work for someone else or if we work for ourselves, right? And if we are in I've had a number of people in the last year say, I'm not really following the ranching for profit model because I'm subsidizing the business. I'm not paying myself a wage. It's like you own 100 lambs. Mm-hmm. It's not a full-time job. Mm-hmm. You own 100 heifer calves. Like that's not a job. You should be subsidizing that business, right? Yes. Because that business can't carry you.
Yep.
But to my mind, that's a defined life cycle, right? And again, back to this life cycle in your career, there's a time in my mind where it's very appropriate to put outside money in. But again, you do it with the idea that it stops there, and it doesn't have to be a hard deadline, but there is a transition from I am putting money in to now we're not putting money in.
Right.
And you and I both know people that are now in their 70s who mom has had a job the whole time. They have, or sometimes mom and dad have had a job the whole time. They've completely subsidized the ranch, and they've done it for their entire career, and there's never been the transition to we carry the ranch, now the ranch carries us.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think that like in my situation, specifically, literally, my ranch will produce 9 cow-calf pairs a year. That's what my ranch, the plot of land I sit on, can do. So
one full-time employee is pretty heavy.
Yeah. So we have about 90 days of labor every year that has to happen, and even at that, it's only at most 2 hours a day. So we're talking 180 hours a year that we put into this thing because that's what it, we don't try to make it at something it's not. We recognize where we're at, and someday we'll be somewhere else, but we're not there right now.
Right.
And so I think that's important.
And you have that ability because you have another job, right?
Yes.
You have another source of income. And if you do it with the correct strategy, and this goes back to Bud's, whole deal of do the right thing until it works. If you are persistent in that strategy, you will get ahead. And again, I think this is where Dave Ramsey's incredibly valuable, is he is teaching persistence, right?
Yeah.
Do the right thing
Gazelle
and keep
intensity,
doing it.
that's what he calls it.
That's exactly right. But it's not gazelle intensity for 2 days. It's planned to do this for your career, right? You're going to work.
Yep.
It's expensive to support us, right?
Yep.
We eat, we drink, we drive around, like just stuff costs money, which maybe helps a little bit when we talk about capturing asset appreciation. One of the things that I neglected to talk about recently in one of our client webinars was we sell to generate cash flow and we buy back so that we can stay in business, right? And this idea that we are constantly replacing, right? That turnover allows us to produce cash flow. But if you sell an asset, such as at the beginning of a drought, and then sit on your hands for 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, 6 years, your balance sheet is declining, right? Because you are spending money out of there, whether you're running cows or not, whether you're growing hay or not, right? The time has its own cost, and that never stops. You can reduce it, right? You can get rid of all the direct costs, but you generally can't get rid of the mortgage payment, right? You don't get rid of the interest. You don't get rid of, the utility bills and the property taxes and those types of things. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And so is this a ranching.fyi webinar?
So, yeah, good question. So that actually was a Ranch Right. We do a monthly webinar for our clients and prospective. It's pretty much free to the public. Originally, it was a client-only thing, but we do a webinar monthly where we talk about it. The theme is understanding your financials. So we've done one on understanding your balance sheet, and, what it means, understanding your P&L and what it means. We did one recently on we've done a couple on value of gain with Wally, and one on sell-by marketing within a breeding herd. And we're 5 or 6 months into that deal, and it's been a ton of fun. Again, our idea originally was that it would be a fairly small crowd. I think we want to grow it. Now, we also, I do a lot of that stuff now, with Wally and ranching.fyi also, and that has a little bit different focus. It's not so purely financial like our company stuff is.
Sure.
But again, the same idea that, really there are a lot of great sources of information, and really getting a more interactive, sort of more dynamic discussion around some of these things that are maybe more at the fringe of what the majority of people are talking about, and maybe not quite in the exact vein of regenerative agriculture per se, but which really offer people a lot of power. Our clients have access to both. We have ranching.fyi has a subscription program, so we produce often 1 or more videos a month. We do some live events. We just did one on current market conditions with Wally that was really well attended. And very much like what Ranching for Profit is doing with their Ranching for Profit Online, I think they complement each other, really nicely. And on those days, like the week before Christmas when we did our company one, it's 40 below outside, the wind's 40 miles an hour, and it's 70% humidity, like no better place than to be in front of the computer. Great day to work on the business. That's exactly right. And again, to really challenge your own, we talk all the time about challenging paradigms, which drives me, you get tired of that after the word paradigm is tiring after a while. But that same idea, this, chance to really crash our mental models into something different is what we're really after. Yeah. And for me in our company, the real driver of this is we spend a lot of time producing financials for customers. We spend a lot of time talking with customers about financials. And it's become very clear that one of the things we need to do is education just in that realm. So I love the Ranching for Profit School, right? In a 7-day school, you cover everything from finance, economics, succession, grass management, fence building. I mean, there's a huge swath of that. My goal with our products, and we're working on a new one that I'm pretty excited about, is to take that, what Ranching for Profit covers in about a day or a day and a half, and do month after month on that very topic. Because I think once you dive into, so funny because I'm such a nerd, but once you dive into the financials, the more you do, the more interesting it gets, the more nuance there is, and the more power there is. Yeah. Right. So that's kind of where we're going. And we've started with this understanding your financials to cover the basics. What we're working on now is a way of really teaching people and walking with them as they go through this wealth accumulation and sort of asset management phase, because this is the part that nobody else teaches. Yep. And it's frankly even hard to learn in the sort of general world of small business. There aren't a lot of resources there. Sure. And it's a place that it would be inappropriate to try to shoehorn it into our 1-week Ranching for Profit class, right? You just wouldn't be able to do it justice. But if you can talk about it month after month after month, then it has a lot more value. Yeah.
All right. Last question. We've made this whole arc now, and we've seen the writing on the wall, and we've been preparing for it. But how do we transition?
You asked me this question once, and I failed to answer it.
I don't know if I did, but
yeah, you did. Okay,
how do we start extracting money out of the business into an investment type of a?
So the
passive income.
Correct. So the first is just and it's different for everybody, but the first is to just think of what are the assets that require less work, right? So again, thinking of real estate and the ability that you have to just rent it is one very good one. But it takes a lot of asset to rent real estate at a level that will support your family, right? So that would be one big part, is just thinking about the amount of work required. And then the other one that is huge in my mind, and Walter Lynn is very good at this, is transition as you're at the end of your career, when you're transitioning out, put yourself in a position where you have the best tax advantage. Okay, now at this point you have accumulated a significant base, okay? And if you pull that cash out like it's ordinary income and get taxed at 40%, that's a huge hit. Mm-hmm. So I present my wife the scenario of, would you rather sell $1 million worth of assets and pay $400,000 in taxes or $150,000 in taxes? Not a very hard question to answer, right? You could actually live on the difference, right? I mean, you could buy a house on the difference, right? So putting yourself in a position, and this is one that again, we don't preach tax avoidance or anything like that, but we convert to assets that have big tax advantages, okay, and require less input. And those are, when we get into the specifics of how you do that, again, it's very individual, but there are some general trends, right? And again, we have to go back to the principle that different types of income are taxed differently, and capital gains and asset type income is most favorably taxed. And in some cases, it's not taxed, right? In some ways, there are actually ways to exit out of the business without paying any tax at all. There's another strategy that we have available to us in ag that is not available anywhere else, where we can defer taxes for decades. It's a place to get very careful, but done correctly, it can be if deferring a tax bill for 30 years, if you think you could do better with the money in the meantime than the government, then that's definitely something to look at. If you're
set the bar a little higher. No.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, but that's literally where it's set, right?
Yeah.
So not too hard to beat. But there's some complexities there, and some really specific details will become incredibly important. And then, like I say, working away from no tax. Right, so if you pull out capital gains at a certain, below a certain dollar figure, then you're literally not taxed. Once you get into those middle tax, the middle capital gains tax bracket, it's taxed at a very reasonable level, right, at 15%. It may be better to delay it 30 years. It may be better to go ahead and pay the 15%, but then contrast that with just pulling it all out blind, as a last minute, no planning decision, right, at 40%, that's a disaster, right? That is a horrible choice. You've spent years and years accumulating that to give away 40% of it.
Yeah.
Or 30%. I mean, whatever the actual rate is, but it's up in that range. If you live in a place like California, it's significantly worse, right? We live in Wyoming. South Dakota has no income tax, right? So, I mean, we have advantages in Tennessee and Texas and Wyoming and, Nevada, that sort of thing. The last piece of that, I think, is if real estate does become part of your strategy, real estate is always an after-tax transaction. So if you can pay for real estate with cash flow from inside the business, that will be taxed. But it is taxed. This is where people think like a 401k. It will be taxed at whatever your tax rate is at the time. But again, if you're exiting the real estate business, you can often do that tax-free. Does that make sense? So even better than pregnant cows, which you might be doing at 15%, the exit from real estate can be very, very advantageous. But again, you've paid for that with after-tax dollars. Let me go down another road. I regularly encourage people, if that's what they want to do, to invest in a 401k or a SEP or an IRA or something like that. The fundamental of that, though, is a bit flawed in that you convert capital gains income in an IRA to ordinary income, right? You're kind of going the wrong way on the tax spectrum. All of the people that advocate for that, and again, I don't want to push people away from that, but if you are in a position where not doing that is a good choice in your life, you are better off to keep that asset money and pay the tax early. Because again, as I get closer to retirement, I think when I have free time and don't have kids in the house and don't have bills, I plan to actually live on more, not less, right? And the argument with retirement is that, it'll cost you so much less to live, that you will be withdrawing at a lower income than your working life, blah, blah, blah. When I see people with medical bills and long-term care costs and that sort of thing, I don't actually see that happen very often. We go back a few years ago and we used to talk about senior citizens living on cat food, right? Because Social Security wasn't covering their... I have no interest in that retirement, right? I have an interest in a retirement that is way better than what I'm currently living. I plan to be in a higher tax bracket. And so I don't want to put money into that type of retirement. Now, if you're a W-2 employee, you better put money in. Often there's a match, 100% return. If you can do a backdoor Roth and convert some of that, I think all of that is great. If you are not someone that manages money or doesn't trust yourself or your spouse to do that, I think pile it in there. I can invest in my own assets outside of a tax-sheltered retirement fund. There's no top amount, right? As opposed to a tax-sheltered, or tax-deferred type investment opportunity where it's $6,500 or some, fairly small amount. So again, that's another place where we want to be very careful about our long-term strategy and be kind of consistent. Taking money out of the business to put it into a 401k, if you're running a really good business, is not a good idea.
Yeah, very good. How can people get a hold of you?
Best place is through the website for our company, Ranch Right LLC. I have a calendar link on there. You can book a call with us. My email is also on there, and my phone number is on there. Email is John, John, at ranchrightlllc.com. And my phone number is 435-881-2871. Text is the best. Don't leave a voicemail. Please.
Yes, very good.
Unless you're 70. If you're 70, you can leave a voicemail. If you're less than 70, type out a text.
Very good. John, thanks for your time today.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. It's been fun.
Very good stuff there with John, and not exactly sure what direction we're headed going forward with the Working Cows podcast as far as next week's episode. I've got a few things in mind, and we'll have some feelers out to some folks in the next day or so, but we'll see what materializes, and we'll be back again real soon with another episode of the Working Cows podcast. We'll see you then.
We invite you to visit workingcows.net to subscribe to the show via iTunes or Stitcher. You'll also find detailed show notes pages, resources from our guests, and the industry leaders who have influenced them. For more ideas on putting your cows to work for you in a more profitable way, tune in next week.